Hello, I'm Dan Pasternak. Today is Tuesday, June the 23rd, 2009, and I'm here in New York City at Rockefeller Center to interview Mr. Dick Ebersol about his career and his life in television for the Archive of American Television.
You all reside in LA, I take it, right?
I'm from LA, but currently residing in Atlanta.
Oh,
Yeah.
Atlanta. Okay.
Took a gig with Turner Broadcasting, so that moved us there.
Gotcha.
All right, terrific. All right, we'll start at the beginning. Tell me what your name was at birth.
Strangely enough, my name at birth was Dickie Duncan Ebersol. Dickie is a family name, last name, on my dad's side. Duncan is my mother's maiden name. And about 2 months after I was born, my then very vibrant godmother apparently sent my parents a telegram saying, enough of this Dickie Duncan, Donald Duck stuff. And so my mother immediately changed my name from Dickie Duncan to Duncan Dickie, which was a subject of some pretty good derision as I grew older, you know, when the frost is on the pumpkin, then it's time for da-da-da-da-da, and I had all that stuff growing up. But I've never been known by any name other than Dick. I think there might have been, two snooty girlfriends 40 or 50 years ago who called me Duncan, but I basically have run from anything other than Dick.
Fair enough. I will call you nothing else. Tell me about where you were born and when you were born.
I was born on July 28th, 1947, in a town in northwestern Connecticut, actually a small city called Torrington, which is where my dad's law offices were. And wonderfully enough about how life comes in circles, all three of my sons were born on the same floor in the same room in the hospital in Torrington, because I moved back east, as the story will become clear later, in the 80s after I married Susan, and we had all three children in the same part of the world. I grew up in Torrington for the next 11 or 12 years of my life, and then moved to Litchfield, Connecticut, which has been, with few exceptions, the principal residence of my life ever since. And that's a town of about 6,000 or 7,000 people, probably one of the two, if not three, best preserved colonial towns in America. And it's never been repaired or restored by any professional body. People have really kept up the houses. The majority of the houses are in the 1750 to just post-Civil War era. They line these incredibly wide streets that would remind you of something like Washington, D.C., the way they were originally laid out. There are several in which George Washington actually did sleep, because Litchfield was on the pathway between New York and Boston, because you wanted to go as far north as possible so you didn't have to ford as many wide rivers. Litchfield's also the home of the first law school in the United States, where, among others, Aaron Burr was a student. It later moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and became Yale Law School in the 1800s. And there are other historical things. The first girls' preparatory school, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was born down at the corner of the street I have my house on today, and only about 600 yards from the house I grew up in.
And is the house in which you're living one of these beautiful old colonial?
Ours was built in the 1870s, and it's quite extraordinary in that I think it was, first of all, it was built as a weekend house, and it was surrounded on all sides, on both the first and second floor, by enormously wide porches where people would sleep on those during the summertime. It was screened in so that they would get the circulation of the air. But what makes our house unusual, and we've lived in it now since '82, the house that we have today, is that I think it was much more of what's called a Federalist house. It looks colonial on the outside now that those porches have all been stripped away. But the ceilings are enormously high for a house in New England, which is what really appealed to me. I mean, the first floor, the ceilings are 16 feet, and on the second story, I think they're 12 feet. So that's quite unusual for anything that was built in New England in the 17 or 1800s.
Oh, sounds lovely. So now talk a bit about your childhood, your parents, your family, and the circumstances of your youth.
Well, those first 11 or 12 years that I was growing up in Torrington, which is an industrial town, which was thriving then in the late 40s and early 50s, the whole Naugatuck Valley, which basically runs from Bridgeport up through Waterbury, up north through Torrington and Winston. And Winston was the home of some real characters like Ralph Nader and David Halberstam, among others, grew up there. But in any case, Torrington was this vibrant community, largely brass. Business was quite big there, copper, lots of finished products like roller skates and ball bearings and so on. But being a very vibrant town, it had 3 movie theaters, which including one beautiful Warner Theater that had been built at the height of the Depression by the Warners, which has since been restored largely through the efforts of some people, including my wife, who returned to the stage. She'd been retired for a heck of a long time, but she returned to the stage and did the miracle worker there for a while, and that was where they got enough money to really restore the stage from the sold-out performances that she had. About 1,100 people a night over Thanksgiving years ago. But in any case, my dad was a country lawyer, and a judge as well in that part of the world. He was a real brainy guy. He'd gone to Haverford, Yale Law School, served as a PT boat commander in the South Pacific, and then later was the head, before the war ended, of Naval Intelligence in Philadelphia. He'd gotten malaria toward the end of the war, came back, and on VJ Day, August 14th, 1945, which happens to be my wife's birthday, but in any case, he met my mom at a VJ party in Philadelphia. They married within 3 months and moved to northwestern Connecticut, where he became the junior partner in this, up to that point, 2-man law firm, 2 brothers who lived in that neck of the woods. And my dad specialized in just about everything. He was a general practitioner in law. But what made my dad an enormous figure, not only to me, but to so many other people, he was born with this sense of public service that was pronounced. He was the head in that part of the world of the YMCA for 4 decades. He was the head of the trustees of our wonderful Congregational Church for more than 3 decades. And probably most noteworthy and quite extraordinary, he started off as a door-to-door fundraiser for the American Cancer Society, I believe in 1948 in Torrington. And by the end of the 60s, he was the head of the Cancer Society for all of Connecticut. It's a layman's job, no pay or anything else like that. He continued his law practice. And by the early 70s, he was the president of the American Cancer Society. And then when he retired from that, I think it was only a 2-year stint, he then moved on to become the vice chairman of the International Cancer Society and really taught, strangely enough, some of the leading Arab countries about volunteerism and how to raise money, because it's a pretty uniquely American thing. It's changing now. The rest of the world's sort of catching up, but certainly well into the 80s or even the 90s. I remember putting together the Barcelona Olympics and seeing, at least initially, how hard it was for that area of Spain to find volunteer workers, because there was no history of volunteer work, not on a large scale. But anyway, Dad got to know President Sadat of Egypt, the Shah of Iran, all this period in the latter 70s, or both of those fellows were out of power by the end of the 70s, and Sadat, I think, sadly died in 81. But he worked with them in building up the cancer societies in their particular countries. So he had a pretty extraordinary life, but it was always about other people. And that's why it's kind of extraordinary that some wisecracky media guy would emerge from a man like that. But what his great influence on me, Dan, more than anything else was, I just never wanted to disappoint him. I always wanted to be the best at whatever I was going to do. And studies came really easily to me. And ultimately, I'm skipping over a fair amount and I'll backtrack, but I think probably the fundamental thing that set up all of my life in media was from something my father did at the end of my junior year of high school. By then I was living in Litchfield. I moved there for the end of my 7th grade year. And that's only about 6 miles away, but it's a huge difference because Litchfield is really a beautiful, rural, pastoral setting. And Torrington was an attractive, but it was an industrial city. In any case, he decided near the end of my junior year of high school that everything was too easy for me. I was first in my class academically and running the student body and stuff like that. He thought it would all come way too easy, so he insisted that I take this scholarship through the American Field Service program. And I spent my senior year at a high school in Normandy. And it was a wild adventure, and I'll encapsulate it by saying that the key thing was that soon after I got to France, I had a very bad accident and hurt one of my legs, knee, and I ended up spending about a month in the American hospital in Paris as a 17-year-old. And it was my dad made his decision, a second decision that was very important, which was he thought that I should tough it out and stay there, so I did not come home. And it was really good because during that year I got my real sense of independence. I would talk to my parents maybe once a month on the telephone because there was no ease of using the telephone. There were no cell phones. I think my mother wrote me every day for about 11 months, and I probably wrote her almost that often back and forth. So I was clearly at that stage in my life a mama's boy. And but it broke the ties. I mean, it didn't break them in any sense of love, but it broke any sense of dependence that I would ever have again on anybody. And I thought it gave me a great break at that particular point in my life. And then the third break came in June of 1965, and the last month that I was in France as this teenager who'd gone through a lot, because that month in the hospital, then I had to come out and rehab in the middle of nowhere in Normandy, and my French was okay and got better, but I'd missed a lot by being in the American hospital in Paris, but that was the best hospital there was, and to be proven by the fact that my two mates on my floor were Elizabeth Taylor, who was going through one of her many illnesses. She was in Paris making a movie called The Sandpiper or something like that, and down the hall was some Arab ruler who had some reverses, and he wasn't apparently very popular because there were always at least 6 guys with submachine guns outside of his door, and that for me was the first time I'd ever seen guns anywhere but in a movie. I mean, I'd seen hundreds, but guys with machine guns in a hospital in France was quite extraordinary, at least to me. In any case, in that month of June, excuse me, I went to the car race at Le Mans, France, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Certainly in the mid-60s was the second or third most important car race in the world after the Indy 500 and perhaps the Grand Prix of Monaco through the streets of Monte Carlo. But Le Mans was a huge deal, and when I went to the track, which is on country roads and a little bit of a track itself, and the track's over 8 miles long, 800,000 screaming French were all looking to find a vantage point to watch the race. I wasn't interested in that. I went looking for the people of the wide world of sports, because I had seen in the early 60s that my poor eyesight, I'm wearing contact lenses as I have since the mid-70s, really limited my ability to hit a baseball or really to do a lot of things well, hand-eye coordination, but I love sports so much. And so I had fallen into, in my high school years, of initially being a JV kind of player, but I was the one who phoned in the stories to the local paper after the games. So I had an attraction to all of that. In fact, as a 12-year-old, when I first moved to Litchfield, the oldest weekly newspaper in the United States is called the Litchfield Enquirer. It's not quite what it was then today, but I wrote a column called Dear Ebby, where I gave social advice. They tell me, I don't remember, but they say occasionally I'd even write advice for the Leavenworth that had everybody in hysterics because I was 12. But in any case, I went to this racetrack looking for the wide world of sports people, and I got hired as a gopher. Go for coffee, go for ice cream, go for cigarettes. And that started an association such that when I came back to the States that summer, which was an adventure in itself, the ship I came back across the Atlantic in, the engine room blew up in the middle of the Atlantic. The ship was called the Seven Seas, and it was filled with nothing but American high school and college kids. Nothing but. It was a university kind of ship, and we were in transit from a port in western France to New York, and we were literally in the middle of the Atlantic. I haven't told this story in years, but and we just sat there. Now, fortunately, in the North Atlantic, early July is not a bad time. A month later could have been a real adventure as hurricane season developed. But we sort of just floated for several days before an ocean-going tug could come all the way out, I think from Portugal, that towed us into St. John's, Newfoundland. But I often wondered, how many unwanted children were created on that flight, on that boat. None by me, but you put that many kids on a boat at that age, I don't care if it's before the sexual revolution, there has to be some result. Why am I telling this story? But anyway, I got back, and that fall I entered Yale, and almost from the beginning, Ivy League football was still then capable of mounting even top 10 teams. Yale would, while I was there, I think be number 8 in the country. But by the 70s, it became very hard because they just couldn't get enough athletes to be deep, and so they were lucky if they went through a season and didn't have many injuries, then they might be competitive. But they were basically just playing each other by then. So, but anyway, ABC Sports, the home of Wide World of Sports, had the college football deal. So if they came to New Haven to do a college football game, I continued being a Gopher. If they came to do a Wide World of Sports show for swimming, Don Scholander was a great Olympic champion at the time. He was a Yale swimmer. I would get hired. And so we had this loose association, and through my freshman and sophomore years, I would say I probably did 9 or 10 events for them that way. It wasn't a lot of money, I think it was $25 a day or something, but it was, you were really around some of the biggest names in the business, and you were trying to soak up as much information as you could. Lo and behold, at the end of my sophomore year of Yale, which would have been May of '67, I was planning to go to London for the summer with my roommate, and his family had some ties to Time magazine, and we were going to work there as sort of interns or something. And one day I came back to my room, and under the door was a letter with the ABC Sports letterhead on the outside of the envelope. And it was a note from a fellow named Chuck Howard, who was head of production at the time at ABC Sports, saying, Roon has decided that he feels the one area that we can really be helped is to have a researcher who does nothing but really get to know the great athletes of the world. Because we have done now, at this point, 1 Olympics. ABC Sports had done the Innsbruck Winter Olympics, their first experience. And we found that there's not a great way to get information. And usually the way we get information is, unfortunately, reading it in the papers the day after we've already shown the television show that come out of the winners' interviews with print reporters or whatever. And so I was invited to come down to New York and interview for the job. And I think there were 5 other people that had gotten the same letter for one position. And I just knew almost instantaneously I was going to get this job. A, because thanks to my French adventure, I really spoke French well, and the first Olympics up was going to be the Winter Olympics in 1968 in Grenoble, France. And then 8 months after that, the Summer Olympics in Mexico. That's back when Olympics were all in the same year. They didn't split apart until after '92, when the Winter Games went into a cycle in '94, so that they happened in the non-summer years. It was a great idea that Dennis Swanson dreamed up, and then never won a bidding competition so that he could executive produce an Olympics while he was the head of ABC Sports. But the IOC bought the idea. It's great because 2 Olympics in the same year is way too big a strain on the American advertising marketplace. It just, they're such big events and they drain so much money. To have 2 in the same year, and they were always in the same year as the American presidential election. So that was a really big drain on television advertisers. So that was a great break. But in any case, that wasn't the case in '68. I get this incredible job, and what it really means is that I am, the day I started, it was a day before my 20th birthday, so it'd be July 27th of '67. So I was 19 for a day in this job. And basically, they gave me 2 credit cards. One was an air travel card that allowed you to get on any airplane in the world, and the bill would go to some central billing. And the other one was some contemporary credit card at the time. I can't remember what it was, but pay for hotels or meals or whatever. And my job was basically to roam the United States and the world, but primarily Western Europe, because the Winter Olympics were basically European or North American centric. There weren't many athletes of consequence back then who were Winter Olympic athletes who could fit into the real championship run of the Winter Olympics.
So now you were, this is the end of your sophomore year at Yale.
Yes, and I've dropped out. I drop out almost immediately, which sets up a very interesting thing because college dropouts in 1967 in the middle of the Vietnam War is considered a rather hazardous thing. Now, fortunately for me, I made all these decisions while my parents were on the first, I know, because I never went on one with them, extended vacation of their lives, because my dad would never take off more than a week in the summertime. He was just too dedicated. And if it wasn't to his work, it was to his public service. So he and my mom and my younger brother had gone off on a tour through the western United States and western Canada for more than a month. So I made all these decisions on my own. And I did, however, ask my college roommate's dad, who happened at the time to be the governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton. I asked him if he would ask someone in the Pennsylvania State National Guard whether or not they thought, this is before I made the final decision, the problems that I still had with my knee and my eyesight, which is really terrible. I mean, it's 2,800 in one eye. So would that probably disqualify me from service, armed service? And they all thought it would, but no one could guarantee that because, first of all, I would face a draft board in Connecticut, not in Pennsylvania, so that they had no rhyme or reason. It was just me asking, trying to get some information. So I immediately went off to work with ABC. I think my second day of work, I got on an airplane and went to the Pan Am Games, which were in Winnipeg, Canada. And so much for the glamour of television, because when I got there, I found out our entire setup in order to save money, because ABC did not have money at that particular juncture. Everything they did other than ABC Sports was third place out of 3 networks. And they were really fighting to scrape by. Leonard Goldson's an amazing figure in American television history. The things that he was able to do to keep that company alive without the resources that Paley had or Sarnoff had behind CBS and NBC is pretty remarkable. But anyway, so here I am in a basement in Winnipeg with all these different feeds coming in. I'll never forget, I got a phone call from New York the first Saturday, about 4 days on the job, and they said, hey, just make sure you tell so-and-so, I don't remember who so-and-so was, that there'll be no promo audio from the remote. And I'm thinking, man, I must be talking to somebody on the moon. Now let me parse this. No promo audio. Okay, audio must mean sound. Promo. Yeah, a promotion? Okay. From the remote. No, the remote. Oh yeah, we're the remote. We're the remote. We're not in the studio, so we must be in the remote location. I mean, it sounds so simple today, and for anybody who's probably going to come ever watch this or listen to this, they're going to say what it does. But I was I was just 20. I'd never really heard this kind of stuff before, even in the 9.
I mean, what kind of training did you get before they just
No,
sent
I
you
was
out?
well. First of all, I wasn't there initially to do television. I would very quickly determine that I wanted to do television too. I was the researcher. My job was to be there to get to know as many athletes as possible. So I just would be in this basement when there was nothing going on with the athletes. I would go down in this basement where they had all these tape machines and a makeshift studio.
But because ABC has had such finite resources, I guess what it
Right,
has
but
created more opportunity for you to do a lot more than research.
I'm sorry, I need to go.
Where we were.
I do remember where we were. Just tell me when we're rolling.
We're rolling.
All right, so you're on the first stop of your job as a researcher
Oh, yeah.
for ABC Sports, and you're up in Canada, and you're trying to figure out all of the technical terminology being thrown at
Yeah.
you.
Now, as I was saying, that none of them were key for me to know at that particular point. I would quickly get an all-consuming desire, not only to know the athletes and to figure out what the stories were or are, but I really wanted to know how to tell them. So I would have to gradually learn about television on the job as it went along. But hey, I was out of school. This was my university. It happened to be the greatest university in the world because the chairman of the faculty, the president of the university was Roone Arledge, who in my opinion still today is arguably the single most important figure in modern American television history, because he's the only person to clearly creatively dominate 2 fields. He's the father and probably still the most important figure even in death in American sports television. And he single-handedly changed the idea of how news was produced in the United United States during the whole period of time he ran ABC News.
At what point did you come into contact with Rune Arledge?
Oh, very quickly.
And
Because
then
it was his.
talk about him.
Well, you have to remember this job as being an Olympic researcher, which has grown into probably the best entry-level job that you can have in all of television, because right off the bat, you start off with a real job. You're not somebody's assistant. You're expected to get out there, travel the world, get to know these people, write them up in cogent 3-4 page outlines of who these people are, what makes them tick, what their backstory is, so that the Jim McKays of today, or in my case, the Jim McKay, the original, would never be caught unawares of who these people were. And that was everything to Arledge, because Arledge felt the only way the Olympics would work as an event. And by the way, he was so right. I mean, I never hesitated when I started having my own Olympics in Barcelona in '92 to tell the world, I'm going to take this guy's model. I may update it a little bit, but I'm not looking for any great creative credit here. He said the Olympics would only work if it was about storytelling, because the vast majority of sports, and certainly the overwhelming majority of the participants, the athletes, are not known to the American audience. The American audience that follows sports pretty much follows their own teams. Pro and college football, baseball, basketball, college and pro, little golf, little tennis. Way back when, track and field was high up there, but through a lot of inept management, it got driven way down, and it only pops up at the time of the Olympics, just like most of the Olympic sports. But it then becomes the single most engrossing thing in America during the time they take place. And why does that happen? Because of storytelling. You develop a bond with these athletes. And what Rune knew intuitively then, and then began to articulate it as the years going on, and I think I've probably talked about it more even than he ever has. The real reason for the success of the Olympics in the United States is women. The Winter and Summer Olympics are the only two sporting events, the only two. They may be the only two events outside of the Oscars where women vastly outnumber men in the viewing audience. If you leave out children, and up to the age of 12, who probably make up less than 10% of the audience, the basic split for an Olympics is 60% men and 40% women. And that's the reason why we earn an enormous premium for advertisers, because this is a hard to reach audience, particularly with the passion they bring to watching, because they'll watch 4 or 5 hours a day during the time of the Olympics. All of that comes from what Arledge initially grasped, which was make these people empathetic, understand what makes them tick. It's not enough to say, hey, they can run the 100-meter dash in 9.5, or that they've won 97 ski championships. How did they end up on that hill? How did they overcome the real obstacles in their life? What got them to this point? Because particularly women will react to the struggle. We find in all of the research, and I'm not that big on research, but I do a lot of it around the Olympics, because I want to know, it's changing now that we can put so many thousands of hours on of an Olympics, because we have so many platforms to show it on. But back when it was one channel, I always worried, because it was just my vision. It was just what I thought the audience wanted to see. So I would want, after an Olympics was over, to know whether I was right or wrong, because I wasn't there to try to force my view down people's throats. That'd be stupid. I wanted to get the largest possible audience. But anyway, it all came from Rune's sense that storytelling would be everything. And he had found that, he didn't find that for the Olympics, he'd found that with Wide World of Sports, because who the hell had ever watched barrel jumping before, or Acapulco cliff diving, or any of those things? It wasn't enough just to see them do it. You had to hear their backstory, and the fact that, they had been beggars on the streets of Acapulco 2 years before, or when they thought they'd made it because they were on American television once. When they went back the second time, they said they had dived for free the first time. It wasn't a professionally organized thing. When they went back the second time, they said, oh no, we want, I forget what the number was, but it was pretty high. This is in the early 60s. Let's say that they wanted $20,000 total for the whole thing. And somebody said, well, no, we won't be doing that, and started to pack a few things up. And they said, well, what about $5 a dive? So those kind of things, that's what resonates with people, the little stories, and we would tell stories like that on the air.
Well, I mean, when you think about Wide World of Sports, what everybody remembers is thrill of victory, agony of defeat.
True, but that was actually big time. That's a guy who's going off the ski jump for the agony of defeat. But think of all the other things. Wrist wrestling from Petaluma. figure eights and demolition derby, which were the most popular staples of the first 4 or 5 years of wide world of sports. All those things, as odd as they all sound, the common bond that came out was particularly because of the association of Arledge and Jim McKay. I mean, if there were ever two people who were made for each other, because Jim basically 100% was a journalist, and he always wanted to know the story. So I always felt that I never knew this for sure. I sort of had a sense, to bring this all back full circle, that I was born into the sports television business largely because Arledge and McKay, sitting around sometime in the year or two that followed the Olympics in Innsbruck in '64, was they said, we got to find a way to get the stories. And boom, Chuck Howard remembered to put my name on a list of 6 people as being someone who had seemed to exhibit a lot of curiosity about almost anything under the hat, from my Gopher performances from Le Mans through the next 2 years. And then having French was the absolute winner of all time, because the first Olympics would be in France.
So take us, if you can, quickly through that point of entry where you are thrown in to that first Olympics in Grenoble.
Well, let me back up for 1 second, because I want to add one other thing in hopes that young people will watch this, or some will as the years go by. That first assignment in Winnipeg was it's vague in my mind as to what actually went on in the fields. But the second day I was in Winnipeg, I got a phone call saying, hey, we're in town. And it was my parents who had tracked me down. They knew by then that I'd taken this job, but they were working their way back east. So they came and saw me, and we spent some time together. And during the course of that visit, my dad said, are you going to go back to college one day? And I said, I absolutely will, Dad. I will go back to college, which sets up a whole thing later on where I did my junior and senior year at Yale in 1 year, while I still worked at ABC Sports, but that's a couple of years down the line. But I always thought that was pretty interesting, that, again, my father's timing was perfect. In the second week, something really important happens. The second week, I find myself in Montreal, Canada, and Canada's in the process of trying to win the rights to do an Olympics in the future. So they're staging this huge track meet. I think it was the United States and Canada and the Russians and some other people. And the night before the event's going to take place, we're in this damp, wet, foggy stadium in the middle of the river in Montreal on an island that's, I think, probably reclaimed land. And this diminutive director named Lou Vopicelli, who did a lot of work for ABC at the time, Lou said to me, can I talk to you for a minute, Dick? And I said, yeah, sure, Louis. What would you like to talk about? And we went off for a walk, and he said, I want to tell you one thing. There's only one thing you ever have to remember in this entire business. There is no question that's too stupid. And the reason he brought that up, a little while earlier, I had asked a question, and somebody had really shot it down. And he said, don't ever let them do that to you. Just keep asking the question, because the people in the world, in my opinion, who go the furthest are the ones who never get too embarrassed to want to keep learning. And that's always held me in good stead, and particularly in the television or the motion picture business, any media business. There's a lot of it that you think is going to be romantic and easy and so on. And it's not, because it takes a lot of standing up for yourself. It's a pretty big ego-driven business, and I like to think I have a big and healthy ego. But at that stage of my life, getting that advice saying, no matter what, don't be embarrassed out of asking questions was really key. It sounds easy, but it was great to hear it from somebody who was a big player in those days.
Absolutely.
So go ahead.
So you are beginning your relationship with ABC Sports. You're getting to know Rune Arledge. You're building towards the first Olympics.
Oh, in Grenoble.
So
yeah.
Talk about that experience of doing that Olympics in Grenoble.
Well, first of all, Grenoble's probably the last truly romantic Olympics. We stayed in a very small hotel. It was called Four Roses in French. But the hotel only had enough rooms for all the announcers and a few of the producers, and of course me, because I was the announcer's favorite boy, not because I was charming or cute, but because I had all this information. And I had done books, which sadly I can't find any of them anywhere anymore, but I had done books books on the athletes. I had done books on Olympic histories, but all encapsulated. No big. I knew very quickly television was tidbits.
Quick bites.
Yeah, and that if they had curiosity, the announcers, they would ask me for more. Or they'd ask me to flesh something out. You know, I can't remember all the ins and outs of it, but I mean, all of us were really fascinated by Keeley, who would become, along with Peggy Fleming, the two faces of the '68 Olympics. Peggy Fleming for us in figure skating, and Keeley winning all the major alpine events on mountains not all that far from where he'd grown up in Val d'Isère, France. But his background, I can't remember, his dad had been killed in the war, and the mother had, you know, taken in laundry for the family to survive. I can't remember what part of this is myth or not anymore, because all these things have now been a part of my life for so long. I can't remember what's really true. I'll be the first to admit that when it comes to these encapsulated Olympic histories.
But great profile material.
Oh yeah, and in fact, it was in the run-up to those games. I think it could have been after, but when we were trying to get together on a name for that. In fact, it was after. It was in the summer of '68, because the Summer Olympics in '68 in Mexico didn't happen until after the World Series was over in October. And but in a conversation in New York, probably like in August of '68, Rune sort of said one day, "Got to come up for a name for this." And I think he and I were in his office with two other people, and it was in that conversation that we fashioned Up Close and Personal, which then became, you know, a catchphrase for, still is over 40 years later. But in any case, here we are in this real intimate setting in this hotel, and it was, you know, there were just such characters there. It's just such a throwback to what you would want to think television was. It was, I would get lessons in eating glass, because there were these big brandy cups, and most of our color announcers who came from the traveling sports world had learned all kinds of unbelievable habits, and these really, really thin, like brandy glasses, they could teach you how to take the glass and completely chew the whole glass up. Real glass, it wasn't plastic. And now, of course, at a particular point in time, you would then expectorate the whole thing. But the point was, people would sit there, and the first couple of times, you can't be serious doing this. But in any case, it was an unbelievable time. And I remember the first time that two announcers fought over me, which actually almost reduced me to tears. It was a couple of nights before the opening ceremony in Grenoble. And we were having a very, very early dinner. Kurt Gowdy, who's probably one of the most famous announcers in American sports history, did so many World Series and Super Bowls that I think his records probably still stand today for the most, but the quality of his broadcast, the old cowboy was his nickname. And he was so close to Arledge personally, even though he was a full-time NBC guy, he would always come back and do the Olympics, usually hockey. And he also did American Sportsman, which was Arledge's show for fishermen and hunters. But in any case, Gowdy and his wife and I were having an early dinner because Kurt and I were going to drive to Geneva, which was about an hour and a half away, I think, to watch the U.S. hockey team play its last game before the Olympics started. And Jim McKay and his wife, Margaret, were sitting at the table away. And I guess dessert was just coming, and Jim called me over to his table and said, "Young man, what do you have planned for tonight?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going with Kurt over to Geneva to watch the hockey game." And he said, "No, you're not." And I went, "What?" And he said, "Yes, you are. Going to stay right here." And the opening ceremony is only 48 hours away. And the last time I checked, that's the only telecast that day, and that's you and me. And we have work to do. And I felt so fought over that, and I had my heart set on going with Gowdy through the mountains to Geneva to watch the hockey. But I stayed up with McKay, and I'm glad I did, because obviously I think more discipline came from my association with McKay than any teacher I ever had in my life. He loved the fact that I existed to have all this stuff turned out, but he also wanted it turned out in a special way, and he really sort of, just like a great freshman English teacher, he banged that into me. Not that I had to write often in complete sentences, it could just be bullet points and stuff, but when I had to write a full story about why somebody's parents had been killed by resistance fighters and da-da-da-da-da, he wanted to make sure if he had to digest all this stuff that it was easily digested. And that opening ceremony was unbelievable. It was a temporary stadium out on the outskirts of Grenoble, just a big empty sort of dirt field. It was early February, I want to say February 6th of 1968. And we were broadcasting it live back in the United States. It was the first time that something more than a few minutes. There were now satellites that were positioned long enough that you could do a whole show. And we brought it back here in the daytime. Very bare bones compared to what opening ceremonies are now, more like a football parade or something like that. But I remember looking up and seeing this big black automobile with Charles de Gaulle standing in the back of it with his arm out, and something that I thought wasn't all that far off from a Hitler salute, but it was this. But my eyes were never that good, as I said. But that was the last thing I saw of that opening ceremony, because the box was so small that by the time the show started, I'm down on the floor of the box, because McKay is here, and his guy who was doing it with him, God, I can't think of who it was. There wasn't enough room for me to sit there, so I'm down on the floor. I have a tiny little monitor like this, and as each country walks by, that was my invention. I had a card for every country who's now wrote, but I would hand him up, and then McKay would have everything from, some factoid about some little-known president of some country who had 17 wives or something like that. All the things you knew would be water fountain material the next day. They wouldn't remember much about the oath of the athletes or something, but they'd remember if the president of some country had 17 wives.
But you didn't see the opening ceremonies because
Oh,
you
no,
were
not then. I didn't see that one.
You saw Jim McKay's knees.
Jim McKay's knees, yeah. In fact, Costas and I had an interesting exchange the other day. I wish I could remember his name. Omar Bongo died last week, and Omar Bongo was the president, if you can believe that name. Omar Bongo was the president of a small African republic, I want to say Gabon, and he died. And Bob has had more fun with his name in opening ceremonies, basically Summer Olympic ceremonies dating back to 1992, mainly because he's the only president that we were ever aware of who was president for life. We always think of president as being a kind of an elective office, probably ignorant on our parts, but anyway, but president for life. So I sent Bob a note and said, were you aware that the beloved Omar Bongo had passed away? And Costas wrote back and said, I guess that takes care of that presidency for life. Anyway.
All right, so just to...
So through those games in Grenoble, that's really more than any other place where my relationship was really made with Rune, because very quickly, I mean, he was aware of who I was, and he was very polite to me and everything, but my French endeared me to Rune, because he found most of the translators couldn't pick up the slang, couldn't pick up the idiom, and so he couldn't really conduct quick, easy conversation. So he started pulling me more and more into his world, and that was the beginning of an association. That he was more my dad in some ways from that point on, for at least the next 6 or 7 years than my dad, because I was really living with Rune. Quickly, within 2 years, that I'd become Rune's assistant as well as a young associate producer, so I would be with Rune 7 days a week unless I was off doing a show myself. But anyway, so...
now, you referred to Grenoble as sort of the last
romantic
Olympic.
Well, it was because just the way we stayed, I mean, the kind of circumstance we stayed in, they were still small. Very little of those Olympics were live, so you take hours to craft everything. Like a wide world of sports, it was post-produced and so on, and it was very intimate. It just wasn't big yet, and it was also a Winter Olympics, and they're by their nature, even today, when both the Winter and Summer Olympics each last 17 days, there are fewer than 1/4 the number of hours of activity in a Winter Olympics as there are in a summer. It's pretty remarkable that we're even able to remotely get 17 days of programming out of them even today. But the Olympics were stretched years ago by a smart agent who wanted to have them run over a third weekend and get a higher rights fee. He didn't throw in enough events to make it easy. But in any case, and the other reason for it was that the security was still much lighter than it is today. I mean, you couldn't just walk into the broadcast center, but you could come damn well close to do that. You could walk right up to the edge of a venue. You could drive your own car and reasonably find parking somewhere in the area. Mexico, which comes about 8 months later. Yeah, comes about 8 months later. Is a much different set of circumstances because there's a student revolution going on in Mexico at the time. In fact, can't remember how many days, Dan, before the opening ceremony in Mexico, but I remember being on a balcony overlooking a square while there was a demonstration going on, and the next thing we knew, the Mexican police or soldiers, I can't remember, I think it was probably a mix of both, just opened fire, and they said a small number of people were killed. I never believed that. There were just so many bodies littering the area afterwards, and I think we read in the last 2 or 3 years that several hundred were killed in that square that day. So it was a different environment. But the Mexican Olympic Games, the Mexico City Olympic Games, are probably the single biggest pivot point in the sports industry in American history, because Arledge has convinced, in the lead up to those games, to put ABC, Mr. Goldenson, to give us an hour and a half every night in prime time, and in some nights 2.5 hours, and that becomes the first time in American television history that there is a regular presence of sports in prime time, because up to that point everything was only on weekends. If there was a World Series game during the week, it was always in the daytime. In fact, all World Series games were in the daytime well into until 1971. There were no telecasts of things like the NCAA College Basketball Championship. Those were done by syndicators, so it was random where you would see it or not see it. Most of those syndication things were not national.
So there had never been any sports coverage in a network in prime time?
Not regularly scheduled. No. There was no World Series games played. The only time you would see sports would be locally in prime time, but never as a network kind of business. It was. I'll get into this in some detail, but basically it was enormously successful. I mean, there was so much going on in Mexico. There was so much controversy because the games were done against boycott by a lot of the major black American athletes not going to the games, and then some of them who went, like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, when they did finish first and third in the 200-meter run, they did the famous black glove thing during the national anthem, which probably got them stupidly, I always felt, kicked out of Mexico City. But the Olympic movement at that point was run by a very reactionary American named Avery Brundage, and anything that he didn't like, you were gone. But in any case, those games stirred up an awful lot of attention, and we see the first real influence of Howard at the Olympics, because Howard was in the middle of all of that stuff, Cosell. But more importantly, everybody starts to take notice that, hey, wow, sports could work somewhere else. Now, it'll be 2 years before Roone wins the argument at ABC. The National Football League, as always, was very smart to this and started talking about a primetime series. But CBS and NBC in, I think, 69, early on in 69, very quickly rejected it, because CBS had that powerful comedy lineup of one of the various latter-day variations of Lucy and so on. And NBC had the #1 movie package, which they played on Monday night. So both of them, who were the traditional carriers of the NFL at that point, refused the NFL's entreaties to buy it. So now it's down to ABC or a very eager Hughes network, because they feel, I think the guy's name who ran it was Dick Bailey, he felt very strongly that ABC was so vulnerable that if they could put together a couple of really strong things, they would become the de facto third network as opposed to ABC. So Roone, using the success that he had had in prime time in Mexico City, convinced Mr. Goldenson to go ahead and let Roone mount what was Monday Night Football for many years. It's now really our Sunday night package. The Monday night package is a cable package on ESPN now, not with the same schedule of games that we have. So
But talk about one of the major tent poles for years on
for
ABC.
Oh, totally.
Programming.
For 30 years.
Monday
34
Night
years.
Football.
Yeah, definitely. But all that, and then the whole, when I made the statement, the largest single event in American sports business history, obviously Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier is very important too. But in the business sense, once you go into prime time, there's so many more people who are watching, which means there's so much more money. So within a year of that, some of the World Series gravitates to prime time. So you've got a strong football presence in the fall season. You've got the World Series. You have more and more things like the NCAAs now becoming something that'll be on network television, like the basketball tournament. All these things were never there before.
And you think that's all the influence of Roone Arledge?
No, totally, because if he doesn't win first of all, if those games had gone on Hughes Sports Network, they would have been okay. But again, independent syndicated networks don't have, particularly way back then, any kind of common way to promote. So they just don't have the same support system that a network in those days could put around something and really focus your attention on it. But by it being on a major network with a guy who knew how to make an impression, and then look at what he does. He takes Howard Cosell, perhaps, the most honored sports journalist certainly of his time, but also probably the most annoying announcer of his time, not only in sports but on all the television. And Howard was great to me, don't get me wrong, but that's how the American public saw him, other than those who were smart enough to see that he was bringing out a whole new side of things that had never been brought out before.
We'll talk about the role at ABC and your involvement with putting together that broadcast team, and talk about the
Well, at that point, Dan, I'm Roone's assistant, so anything I'm doing is basically much more as a spectator than an active participant. I sat in on a lot of history, but it would be presumptuous for me to take much credit for much that happened.
Fair
in
enough,
football.
but
I
that
saw a
group
lot.
of Meredith, Cosell, and Gifford.
Right.
That's
Gifford's not there the first year.
Right.
And that's a very interesting thing, because the first year is Keith Jackson, and Keith is arguably one of the 2 or 3 best football announcers, college or pro, of my lifetime, and I'm about to be 62 as we do this interview. But at the end of the first year, Roone was very close to Frank socially. In fact, Frank had been the one to impress upon Roone that Meredith, who hadn't done anything up to this point post-football, would be a very interesting commentator. That was an idea he got from Frank. And Frank was unhappy at CBS. That's where he was an announcer at that point in his post-football days. And Roone got it in his head when the first year was over that he could convert Frank into a good play-by-play announcer, because he wasn't about to break up Meredith and Cosell. I didn't think at the time it was a very good idea. I was pretty presumptuous, but I basically spent about 3 months trying to talk Roone out of it. And because I had this incredible access that he let me have, I can't sit here and say I earned it, but more than anybody else, I saw Roone all the time. Roone's work habits were such. He was a storyteller. He was soaking up stuff all the time, but he soaked it up in his own unique way. He was not big on coming to work before lunchtime. And then he would stay till 9 or 10 at night. So I, from a very early age, in that job, late 70 through the time I left in August of 74, my workday was 8 o'clock in the morning till 10, 11, 12 o'clock, because I had this access. I wanted to be with him all the time. But on this particular issue of Frank becoming the play-by-play guy and easing Keith out, for 3 months I tried to talk Roone out of it. And he, to his credit, not about that idea, but that he would respect someone who was just his assistant as much to really think that there should be a dialogue here. But I'll never forget the day it all ended. I think it was about April of 71, maybe May. And I had this little office outside of Roone's office, and I felt a presence in the doorway, and it was Frank. And I knew him very well and liked him a lot, still do. And he came in, shut the door, and said, "Dick, you gotta stop this, because he's gonna do this no matter what. And you're just slowing it down, which is making it hard for all of us." And I said, "But Frank, that isn't what you do." And he said, "Well, I'm gonna make it what I do." So that short period of time where I was kind of the gravel and the engine casing, I got that gravel out of the way. Frank did it, I would say, for the next, from 71, he did it for, he was the play-by-play guy till Al started, so he did it for at least 25 years. Or no, a little less than 20, a little less than 20, yeah. So, in the case of Howard, Roone was under amazing pressure from the beginning, Dan. I don't think in my life, and I've been involved with a lot of controversial things, Saturday Night Live for one, various things that have happened at big events like the Olympics and so forth. The advertisers, in particular, Mr. Ford, Henry Ford, and Ford was the biggest advertiser at the time, that first year or two of Monday Night Football. He was not happy, and he was getting a lot of pushback from like dealers who were saying they were getting it from consumers about Howard being involved in these telecasts that had Ford's name all over it. And so he was calling Leonard Goldenson all the time, saying, "Get rid of Howard, get rid of Howard." And I think about week 5 or 6, Roone finally said to Mr. Goldenson, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I will call Mr. Ford myself and tell him that Howard, Roone would never have used this term, but I don't know a better one, that Howard's really the secret sauce here. I mean, having good games and telling the story of those games well is foremost. But Howard is the agitator. Howard's the person who makes these telecasts interesting, and we totally put him there knowing that some people would absolutely love what he does and that other people would be aggravated because it's so different from anything they've ever seen. But this is what our thing is, and this is why we will have ratings even after games become routes at 11 o'clock at night, because they're going to want to know what Howard's going to stir up and how Don is going to shoot him down, because Roone was not an idiot ever in his life. He knew that Dandy Don Meredith is the cowboy figure from Texas, would be America's surrogate in responding to Howard. I mean, it was like, here was America's great storyteller, Roone Arledge, but he also was an incredible dramatist and a comedic writer of sorts.
And a great, I guess, casting director as such, because
totally.
those personalities
Yep.
in Congress with one another and often in conflict with one another
Right.
made for great television.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about what it was that made Cosell, both as a broadcaster and as a man, if you got to know him personally, so unique, extraordinary, abrasive.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I don't think I've worked with 2 or 3 other people in my entire career who had as much raw intelligence as Howard. And he had the incredible ability, I mean, seldom have I ever seen it in anybody else. He had 100% recall. And so as a result, when he used to do his radio shows, and he had these 5-minute radio shows that would air late in the day, like about 5:30 or 6:25, Howard would take a stopwatch out of his pocket, go to a microphone with no notes, and do his entire sports report. No notes. And he might have 4 scores to give. He'd have them locked down solid. He'd have a cogent, quick view of what had happened in those games. Or if he was defending someone like an Ali, because a lot of Howard's reputation, the great journalist reputation, totally deserved, came from Howard being the lone major figure at the time in the late 60s and early 70s to be there for Mohammed, and when the whole system was coming down on him because he refused to step forward at the draft to go to Vietnam. And he said he had no truck against the Vietnamese, and everybody in the system turned on him. He gave up 3 of the most important years of his career to do that. And Howard alone, certainly of all the American television media, and probably the vast majority of the print, took that issue on, and he had Roone's total support. So in those areas, that brain, that absolute, resolute, if I believe in something, nothing, no matter how many people yell and scream and taunt and ethnically slur me or anything else, I'll do that. Flip side of that, though, is that edge is also into bombast. And for those of us who loved Howard, it was amusing. I'm sure to people who didn't know Howard, it wasn't. But I loved Howard. I mean, in those years when I was Roone's assistant and at the same time a producer of sorts, as the years went on, I said before, 10 o'clock at night. So oftentimes they went till 2 o'clock in the morning because Roone was really a night owl, and I would stay with him. He didn't make me, but it was too good not to be there.
That's where you
were
wanted to
learning
be.
all the time, absolutely, and you really were learning. So Howard was a notorious person who would get up early in the morning, so he would call me at 6:30. Dickie, so how was last night? What did Arledge have to say? And after about a week of that, I finally said something to Roone one day. I'm getting these incredible calls from Howard now. I'm still going to work at 8 o'clock, but I don't need Howard at 6. What do I do? And he said, Dick, just tell Howard you've moved on to a different level. He can't call you at that hour anymore. So I told that to Howard. How dare you, you whippersnapper, talk to Howard Cosell like that? Because Howard was always big on the third person.
You referred to himself in the third person.
Oh yeah, and I just start laughing, and that would be the end of it. Howard had it until the last couple of years, the '80s, when Howard just was really bitter. He still had a pretty good sense of humor about himself, but he was definitely full of bombast. But anybody who ever wants to dismiss Howard Cosell is a fool, because his intellect and his courage, raw courage, because there were plenty of people who didn't like him, and a couple of beers would really fortify these people to be incredibly rude and very much in his face. And it never dawned on him at all.
We should probably break 10 minutes there.